Welcome, everybody. Thank you for making it to our summer webinar. It's great to be here with everybody. As I said, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us where you're viewing us from. Gentle reminder that all of our distinguished panel are brilliant women and speakers who are here from a place of humility and belief. I don't think anyone claims to be a religious authority on canon law or scripture, but we are all here as women who have engaged in the study and analysis of how religious beliefs and norms have been understood and their impact on human behavior and attitudes. Of course, there'll always be a difference of opinion as well as thought when it comes to topics like religion, belief, gender, women, violence. But we ask for this to be a space of kindness, inquiry, and understanding. So with that in mind, I'd like to welcome you to the Faith and Violence Against Women and Girls Coalition's August webinar. We are now a charity that seeks to end VAWG. We are a coalition of organizations and individuals who believe that faith and minoritized communities have a vital role to play in ending violence against women and girls. We work at the intersections of faith, race, feminism, and violence against women and girls. We work to build a movement of grassroots groups, organizations, and communities to end violence against women and girls. We also recognize the gap between women's services and faith communities, which leads to barriers in accessing life-saving support. It also entrenches and perpetuates discrimination and harmful racial stereotypes. Our work, we hope, bridges this gap to ensure that women and children who are experiencing violence and abuse in their communities are not further marginalized are holistically supported. I'm glad to say that we have an extremely distinguished panel of trailblazing women for you today. I will introduce each speaker as I ask them my first question. So if we are all happy to start, then I'm very willing to introduce our first speaker. But if there are any questions or clarifications, please post them in the chat. And speakers, are you all happy? Give me a thumbs up if you are. Marvelous, thank you. Great. So our first question is, how did you come to choose this path, or indeed did this path choose you? And I will first come to Professor Asma, and before I ask her to answer, I will give you a brief introduction to Professor Asma, if you don't know her already. But Asma Barlas is Professor Emerita of Politics at Ithaca College, New York, and has written mostly about a liberatory Quranic hermeneutics, in her best-known work being Believing Women in Islam, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Quran, which was published in 2019 and then republished by popular demand in 2002. She was born and raised in Pakistan, where she was in the first cohort of women to join the Foreign Service and has lived in the US since 1983. She has a PhD in International Studies from the University of Denver, an MA in Journalism from the University of Punjab in Pakistan, and a BA in English Literature and Philosophy in Kinnaird College, Pakistan. Professor Balras, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for including me in this conversation about violence against women and girls. As we know, according to statistics, 1 in 3 women is raped or beaten by a man, regardless of where they live or whether they're religious believers or secular. As for how I came to speak of violence in relation to Muslim women and girls, it wasn't a clear-cut path. By way of some background, I was educated in Catholic convents and a Presbyterian college in Pakistan, but was taught to read the Quran at home. But since none of my tutors knew Arabic, I didn't know what I was reading until I came across an English translation at 16 or so. I don't recall paying much attention at that age to the few references in it to men's authority over women, including a husband's right to beat his wife, or to the fact that other verses urged a husband to be kind to his wife, even if she was his enemy or he didn't love her or was divorcing her. Over time, though, I became conscious of this contradiction and was troubled enough by it to start reading about the history and methods of Quranic tafsir, or interpretation. By my late 30s, I wanted to write about how this tafsir was harmful to women, and I would say to men as well, since dehumanizing others also damages oneself. But I soon realized that the real problem was with the interpretations themselves, since they depicted the Quran as the male privileging word of a male god. This was so despite the Quran's warnings not to even use metaphors for God, since God is uncreated and incomparable. So I ended up writing about why attributing a gender to God contradicts the Quran's declarations about God, and why the Quran's references to men's and women's social roles doesn't make it a patriarchal text. By patriarchy, I meant both the tradition of male rule over women and of mapping gender onto biological sex as a way to establish male-female inequality. Significantly, the Quran doesn't endorse either practice. I know such a reading can't end violence against women and girls, which predates Islam, but I hoped it would challenge the religious veneer it's been given by Muslim patriarchies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that resonates for many people. Thank you. Now I shall turn to Rabbi Robin Ashworth-Steen, but let me introduce her to you. Rabbi Robin is currently studying for a PhD in Rabbinic Leadership and Biblical Studies with the University of Leeds under an HRC scholarship. Her thesis is seeking to reimagine feminist prophecy for female leaders in patriarchal religious institutions. Since her undergraduate degree in theology and religious studies at Newnham College, Cambridge, Robin has worked as a human rights lawyer and then began training for the rabbinate at Leo Beck College. She was Manchester's first female rabbi at the Manchester Reform Synagogue. Robin is currently co-chair of the Assembly of Reform Rabbis and Cantors in the UK. She's also a teaching fellow at Leo Beck College and is on the organising team for the International Jewish Christian Bible Week. Robin is interested in creating safe, anti-oppressive, relational, textured activist communities built by individuals who are enabled to step into their own power and collectively organise for a more just world. Rabbi Robin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here and reading all of your bios as you've come in, and it sounds like you've all got better weather than I do in Manchester. So yeah, why did I choose this path, or why did this path choose me? I think probably since I was a baby, I have been stuck in the tension of what it is to live in the world as it is while trying to reach for the world as it could be. I've always felt that tension very deeply. When I was 11 years old, I fell in love with Judaism very deeply. I loved the dialogue, I loved the argument, the critical thinking, the challenge, the curiosity, the music, the stories, and justice being at the heart of it. And the pillar that everyone is created in the image of God. So I grew up in a progressive Jewish synagogue, and I was super geeky. I loved it, and decided to be a rabbi when I was 11, which is quite unusual. So I went on a path, did theology, came out of that at 21 and just felt a bit too young. So went into human rights law, which felt like another manifestation of my practices and my Jewish identity. And then eventually found my way back to what I always wanted to do, which is being a rabbi. However, when and through all of that, I was mainly in women's institutions, educational and legal. And then I hit being a rabbi in Manchester as a first female rabbi and realized how much gender was at play in my religion. Really, I started to recognize I was a woman and how that was harming me in a lot of ways of how I was being treated as well. So I started to see the harm within the institutions, and then started to see that the harm was in the texts and it was in the theology, not wholly, but the institutions we created are in those images, and that religious leaders and rabbis were a big part of the problem. Experiences of betrayal, moral injury, and toxic institutions made me question whether it's possible to stay as a feminist or as a woman within patriarchal systems, even progressive ones. What would it mean to leave? What would it mean to stay? And what am I staying for? So in kind of realizing that it wasn't me that was the problem, I wasn't the damaged one, it was the institutions and the systems of harm, I turned to my PhD to really start to look at how to reimagine and find a new theology or a reimagined theology that came out of some of the best bits of my scriptures, to really see how new thinking can create new realities, how new thinking can end violence against women and girls, of how misogyny can be stopped through new thinking. And I'm going to share a bit about that with you a bit later on. Thanks.
Fascinating. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and I've had a sneak peek and I'm very excited to hear more about it. Thank you very much. Our third distinguished speaker is Sukhvinder Kaur, who has been active in the voluntary sector as former Director of Operations and a spokesperson for a Sikh human rights charity. She has served on a national Sikh body from 2015 to 2018, one of only 3 women advocating within institutions their duties and obligations towards safeguarding. Sukhvinder was chair of the West Midlands Sikh Women's Action Network. She's also the co-founder and chair of Sikh Women's Aid, where she also serves as the Faith and Exploitation Lead. Sukhvinder has recently qualified as a domestic homicide review chair and is currently chairing her first review. Her expertise is invaluable in centering the victims' and perpetrators' faith, cultural values, and any intersecting barriers to seeking support and gaining justice for victims and their family. Sukhvinder, tell us how you came to be where you are today.
Thank you so much, Huda, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here and really humbled to be amongst such an esteemed panel. I can absolutely say this path found me and dragged me on it, kicking and screaming. If I had ever thought I'd be sitting on a panel like this 10 years ago, I would have laughed. My journey with my faith is deeply personal. I was diagnosed with terminal cancer at 17, and I needed to make sense of life and death. So my relationship with my spirituality and my faith, Sikh, literally translates to student. And the unspoken part of that is that you're a student of God. The Sikh scriptures do not contain just the writings of Sikh gurus. They contain the writings of Muslims. They contain the writing of Hindus, because the center has always been about finding the truth within yourself. So that was the foundation of my journey into faith. I wasn't interested in people. I wasn't interested in institutions. I wanted to get to the crux of what my faith was trying to inform me as its practitioner. And it has been probably one of my saving graces in life. When I did start to engage with institutions, I just saw the utter mess that they were in terms of leadership, in terms of governance, and in terms of providing their seekers what they needed. Institutions, I saw, became a middle ground that we had to battle with institutions before we could connect to our personal God, our personal spirituality. And it's something I'm going to talk about a lot later. So I stumbled into the sector because during my forays of going around institutions, and trying to understand just how they served us as women. They weren't serving us as women, and it's been a battle to get to seek women's aid. And I came into the sector because there was nothing within my community that even recognized that women were victims of abuse, let alone faith-based exploitation and spiritual abuse, which Seek Women's Aid, the organization that I helped co-found with my wonderful CEO, Sadish, she was the one who gently brought me into the sector and showed what a powerful force it could be. I've always felt at home with the Faith and VAWG coalition because I feel is where I've said this since the beginning. It's the place I feel most free to be myself, because even the sector has a long way to go in understanding the role of faith, culture and belief in the experiences of victims. And I look forward to expanding on that further on in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukhvinder. Didn't I tell you we have an awesome panel, people? We're very glad to have you all. Finally, and last but not least, our amazing fourth panelist is Dr. Ava Kanyaredzi, who is a senior lecturer in mental health in the Centre of Psychiatry and Psychology at Queen Mary University, London. Her research interests include intersectional feminist perspectives on experiences of the body, violence and abuse, gender, race, culture, faith, mental distress, and forensic psychiatric facilities using qualitative, visual, and creative methods. Goodness, she packs lots in. Her most recent research project looked at Spirit and Solace, Black Churches and Domestic Abuse. It explored the role of faith organisations in responding to reports of domestic abuse. She is the author of Race, Culture and Gender, Black Female Experiences of Violence and Abuse, and that was published in 2018. Dr. Ava, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for being on this esteemed panel. How did I arrive here? Yeah, a very convoluted route. I wanted to do psychology at school. I wanted to be a psychotherapist. And then I got to age 16 or 18 and thought, wait, that's just too scary at this age. So I went off and went into IT, but I always knew I would come back to do psychology. And I was on my way back to becoming a clinical psychologist. I got some work experience in a forensic psychiatric facility, and it just blew my mind. I thought, why does this place look the way it does? Why is it so stratified by race and gender in particular ways? And one of the things I used to do is to read patients' notes at nighttime when I work nights. And there was a lot of violence and abuse in people's backgrounds. People only became visible when they became perpetrators. And I wondered at that time whether there was a link between violence and abuse and mental health. And at the time, we were just being introduced to that in terms of psychology, the link between sexual abuse and psychosis. And it was very revolutionary at the time. So yes, that was my route in. I went to a service user talk, and this gentleman said, I have no idea what my experience would have been like if I wasn't white, male, and middle class. And I thought, oh, how fascinating. And then I went off to look for African and Caribbean heritage women's experiences of violence and abuse and mental distress, and there wasn't very much out there. So I decided to do a PhD and thought, wow, I know lots of people. I'm connected. I'm in churches. This should be easy. That was so funny. Many of the women who I thought would participate in that research, for whatever reason, said no, they couldn't. But eventually I got to interview 15 women and 9 as victim survivors. And I didn't ask them about their faith. And fascinatingly, they all spoke about the importance of faith in their journeys. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the tensions that brought in terms of my academic study and, what I was finding. But that's how I got into this. And I wanted to know more about those faith spaces. And then it just took a very long time to gain funding to do and develop that. in a different way. So it's been a wonderful, kind of crooked, wonderful journey, but it's also been a personal journey of faith, kind of quite a restorative journey of faith along the way. So, yeah, I had no idea that this is where my PhD research would take me. Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad it did, because it brought us you and you to us. It's been really wonderful and touching to hear your commitment and personal experience, but also a sense of righteous sort of seeking of truth and justice, and the desire to, I guess, know yourselves and the divine, and how that plays in all our lives and impacts us here as people, far from having any divine qualities apart from that, or being made in the image of God, or with the breath of God. So if you're from various beliefs, I think your introductions really help us ground our conversation in real life experience. And I'm not going to jinx this, but we are on time. So I will now turn to Professor Barlas to begin her presentation, which should take 10 minutes. And just to reiterate, I will hold up a yellow card at 5 minutes, and I'll hold a red card at 1 minute. And after which I will interrupt to allow the next speaker to present. But I know for a fact that we won't need that with this panel. So Asma, please take the floor.
Thank you. So you had asked me to speak a bit about the opportunities and obstacles I've faced along the way in challenging violence against women and girls. And I want to say that these opportunities have been shaped by the kinds of obstacles all Muslim women face in our society. So I'd rather speak about these and how I've tried to deal with them in my writings. The most notable is that while 80 to 85% of Muslims have never read the Quran and don't read the Quran, they are convinced that its teachings mandate men's dominion over women and girls and allow them to beat and even kill us as they please. The result is that whatever violence men do to women, they present it as their God-given right. To take the most heinous example, men who kill women in the name of their honor believe the Quran allows them to do this, even though not a single verse says men can abuse, oppress, or kill women for their honor or any other reason. In fact, the Quran says God will call to account all those fathers on Judgment Day who kill their girls, and it even chastises those whose faces, quote, darken with displeasure when they hear of the birth of a daughter. Similarly, wife beaters justify their violence by quoting one word in verse 434, idribu, as meaning to hit or strike. But the root of the word has over a dozen meanings, including to leave or to cite, that is to say, to refer to authorities. It is said that the Prophet also forbade men to hit their wives, which he would hardly have done as God's messenger if he thought it contradicted God's will or word. Besides, taking idribu to mean hit or strike nullifies every other verse that urges compassion, restraint, love, and mutuality between spouses. So if we were to read verses in relation to one another, instead of picking single words or lines, we could have a very different interpretation of 434 and some other verses. The problem, however, is that Quran interpreters haven't generally taken a holistic approach to it. Not just that, but earlier generations of scholars also injected ideas into their commentaries on the Quran that contradicted and undermined its core teachings. For instance, they took it as a given that God is male, since the Quran refers to God as he and him. But this is because it is in Arabic, which has a gender for God. And to note the obvious, it doesn't mean God is a male. This being so, there's no theological or logical reason to believe that God favors males or to draw parallels between God and men. Yet there's a saying in Muslim societies that husbands are their wives' earthly gods, and serving and obeying them is like serving and obeying God. In my book, I've argued at length as to why confusing or conflating divine and male authority amounts to shirk, a derogation of God's unity and absolute sovereignty, which is the only sin mentioned in the Quran that God pledges not to forgive. Another obstacle is that interpretations of the Quran rely on the hadiths, which are narratives of the Prophet's life that were compiled centuries after his death and now circulate as oral stories in popular literature in our societies. Among other things, the hadith uphold female genital cutting, stoning to death as a punishment, and portray women as, and I'm quoting from a book by Barbara Stowasser called Women in the Quran. So they portray women as, quote, morally and religiously defective, the larger part of the inhabitants of hell because of their unfaithfulness and ingratitude towards their husbands, unclean over and above menstruation, and evil temptresses, the greatest fitna, that's to say temptation for men, end quote. The hadith also assert that God created the woman from the man's rib, that she brought about their fall from paradise, and that God punished women for this sin by painful childbirth, etc. However, none of these ideas are in the Quran. To the contrary, it teaches that God created men and women from the same self, nafs, feminine plural, named them both Khalifa, or God's subjects on earth, and tasked them to be each other's caretakers or awliya, who have an obligation to, quote, enjoin the right and to forbid the wrong, end quote. Although these teachings affirm the ontic equality of women and men, Muslims not only ignore them, but there's also another common saying that men and women may be equal before God, but they aren't so in men's eyes. This is the extent of the hubris and narcissism of Muslim patriarchies. Yet another problem is that Muslims don't question the methods of Quranic interpretation or why some interpretations became dominant over time, even though what we understand any text to be saying depends on who interprets it, how, and in what sorts of social, political, cultural, and historical contexts. For instance, throughout Muslim history, only a handful of men, all scholars and mostly Arabs or Arabic-speaking, have interpreted the Quran, and right from the start in patriarchal societies. So it's not surprising that the readings of it also bear the stamp of misogynistic patriarchal ideologies. Also, from very early in our history, political and state rulers began to meddle in the processes of knowledge creation, and this continues, as you can see, from how some rulers are still enforcing their own brands of Islam on people today. This is so despite the Quran's teaching that there is no compulsion in religion. It is against this background that I keep emphasizing that no single language, and therefore no text, has only one set of fixed meanings, as is clear from the example I gave of the word idribu. In addition, I make a case for why it's necessary to distinguish between the historical and the normative in the Quran. So to give an example, since the Quran was revealed in a 7th century Arab patriarchy in which certain forms of male authority were already normative, it simply acknowledged this reality in some of its verses. This is very different from having mandated tribal forms of male authority for eternity. In other words, I read certain verses in light of the specific conditions in which they were revealed. But while Muslims acknowledge the occasions on which verses were revealed, they refuse to contextualize those about men's social roles. For that matter, they also reject the idea that anyone other than a religiously trained male expert can speak about the Quran. As one male scholar told me publicly, I should read the Quran in the privacy of my bedroom rather than speaking about it, since, he said, Muslim public reason will never accept your views. Yet, the Quran says it came for everyone, including the unlettered. And this is also what the Prophet was. And it urges each believer to use our own intellect and knowledge, aql and ilm, such as they are, to try and decipher it. Not only that, but as some scholars have noted, it's the only scripture to address women. So I will end by sharing one such verse, which is missing from the collective Muslim consciousness. This is Surah 33, verse 35. That's to say, chapter 33, verse 35, in the translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali. For Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast and deny themselves, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in God's praise. For them has God prepared forgiveness and great reward. I think for believers, there can be no more powerful evidence that women and men are equal before our Creator, one whom the Quran describes as being just and loving and compassionate, who promises not to do zulm, that is, not to transgress against our rights. This is an insight by the Japanese scholar of the Quran, Toshihiko Izutsu. He says God's justice is defined negatively as not transgressing against the rights of another. As Muslims, then, we must ask whether we can worship this God while doing, condoning, or turning a blind eye to zulm against women and girls. Thank you.
That's right. That was really profound. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that verse with us. It's there in the chat for everyone to have a look at, which very clearly evidences the distinction that you made about the divine addressing men and women. There are, I'm sure, going to be many questions for later for the discussion. So I want to ensure that we all get as much time for discussion as possible. So now I'd like to ask Rabbi Robin for her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So I would love to share with you my PhD research because I think it seeks to recognise the harm that runs through religious institutions and the violence that is enacted upon female bodies. But it also seeks to find a model of liberation and a way of reclaiming the beauty and the potential that's within Jewish stories and lives. So it addresses both the obstacles and the opportunities. So my thesis focuses on reimagined feminist prophecy, which is deeply rooted in my textual and storied tradition of Judaism. And it's one that grows as an informed by women, all those marginalised and the politically vulnerable. It's a prophecy of imagination, of poetry, one that's connected to nature and that's embodied. So before I tell you a bit more about it, I want to tell you about the principles that underpin this work as a way of rereading scripture, of reimagining theology, and the power of new thinking in activism and combating the harms as well. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm sure someone will give me a thumbs up to check you can see it. Great, thank you. So I've got 5 principles that I wanted to lay down about how I read and why I stay with biblical studies as a mode of activism against violence against women and girls. My first principle is using the Yiddish ingerangel, which means in loving struggle. Put simply, and I'll read this out for us in a moment, I can't walk away from my tradition. The text and stories that I have are mine, despite the harm that they hold, and I'm committed to finding a way through. And it's vital for me as part of this exercise that I can hold the emotion, the grief, the anger, the betrayal, and the love as a way forward. Rather than dismissing emotion as being irrational, of staying with reason and ration, the gods of reason and ration, my theology is deeply emotional, and it brings the emotions through from lived experience. So here's a quotation from Rabbi Sheila Shulman, who is my teacher, Zichronah Livracha, may her memory be for a blessing. And she wrote this, and maybe it will resonate for others. In short, what I am so angry about is the betrayal again and again of what I love. Then she writes, all of the above, and she was talking about the harm within religion, cannot be allowed to be all of Judaism or the Jewish world. Woven into all that narrowness, that constriction, is a whole other large and powerful stream working to counter it, a stream of generosity of spirit, whose elements are made up of tiny rulings, like being forbidden to hold a labourer's wages overnight, of central injunctions, like remembering we were slaves in Egypt. That is the other thing that follows from the ground I've landed on. There is anger, but there is also love, in minute particulars as well as in grand generalities. So I bring that to try and centre the emotion, the love and the anger, to not throw it all out, but to find a way through. The second principle of the way that I read is about recognising the violence within biblical texts and not apologising for it or contextualising it and saying, well, that was just then and this is now. Because this is a quote from my supervisor, Professor Johanna Stiebert, who has this very powerful sentence. There is violence both in the text and in the outworking of the text. For me, I recognise that biblical words shape our worlds now. I'm going to ask in my readings, what meaning does it hold to us today? What meanings can be created? And I'm looking out for issues of power, violence, oppression, othering, but also choice and compassion. So it's trying to move away from a theology of harm and misogyny to a reading of resistance, but to recognise and not apologise for the violence. The third principle, and this quotation I'm sure is known to a few of us, by Bell Hooks, who wrote, "Feminism is for everybody." For me, my feminism understands that oppression intersects on lots of different lines of gender, of race and class. And I particularly like the phrase by this biblical scholar, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who talks not of patriarchal power, but of hierarchical power. And she writes that it operates not only along the axis of gender, but also along those of race, class, culture, and religion. Hierarchical power, she writes, legitimates white father as a universal subject. So my reading of holy books is also about looking for oppression in all of its forms, how it intersects with sexism, but not ending only with gender harm. The fourth principle is the importance of inhabiting the margins. There's this quotation, a verse, a pasuk from Genesis that calls Avram, the first Israelite, Ha'ivri, which could mean Hebrew, but the etymology of that word means the one who crosses over, the boundary crosser. For me, being on the margins is the most powerful space to be. I'm neither within the establishment nor completely a pariah on the outside. Being on the margins doesn't mean to be on a site of victimhood or exclusion, but can give us a critical gaze to really understand what oppression is. We can see it all from standing on the margins, and that's the really important position for my reading of text. And then lastly, this principle is about, it's a communal awakening. This is not an individual quest by one woman. It's about trying to bring all people together who want a liberation within religion and outside of it. This is a wonderful book. I'm nearly finished it. It's one of the best books I've ever read. It's called This Here Flesh. And Cole Arthur Riley writes, Audre Lorde said, without community, there is no liberation. There is no promised land without a multitude. You think you can get there alone, and maybe by some rare chance you do. But what will become of the promise when it is collapsed by loneliness? Who is going to drink all that milk and honey with you? She's so poetic. She's brilliant. But this is the power of a feminist reading for me, that it's communal. It's not about a hyper individualization of one person, of one male figure, but instead is about a whole community coming together. So why prophecy then? These are the ways that I'm reading texts. Why prophecy? As a progressive Jew, we call ourselves prophetic Jews all the time. It's a pillar. And the prophet is, you've got Jeremiah there in front of you, is an archetype of religious authority. We think prophet, we think man of God. They are the mouthpiece of God. They demand to be listened to. They have divine approval. And for me, the prophet shapes religious leaders today, particularly rabbis. We understand that we are prophets in some way, not that God is maybe speaking to us, but that we're doing divine work in the world. The prophet too is a truth teller, a justice seeker, and that's its greatest power, really, and the beauty, that love that Sheila spoke about earlier. But when we think of a prophet, we think of Jeremiah, a male figure, individual, lonely, suffering. And if you look at prophetic theology, yes, it's about justice, but it's predicated on very harmful theology. And if we just glance at 2 verses, Hosea here, in one of his prophetic oracles says, give to them God, Adonai, give to them what? Give to them a womb that miscarries and dry breasts. And Ezekiel, he writes, and you, O mortal, set your face against the women of your people who prophesy out of their own imagination, prophesy against them. Prophetic theology is deeply misogynistic. They use women all the times. They talk about Israelites who don't conform as being whores. I want to look at prophecy because it looks at the individual man as being authority and seeks to find a new way forward. There's a quote by Judith Plaskow, who's a very famous Jewish feminist writer, who talks about this tension, that at the same time the prophets call for a connection between religious and justice, they also enforce a narrow and monolithic understanding of religion, condemning all who disagree with them as idolaters and whores. So not only is biblical prophecy harmful, it's also almost entirely male. I don't know if anyone read the book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, but she wrote that we read most things as male unless they're specifically marked as female. So even gender-neutral words are read as male. Doctor, male. Leader, male. Prophet, male. Rabbi, male. So the female as an authority figure remains marginal in our imagination, which means they're more susceptible to violence and to harm. What I want to look at is how prophetic and this harmful prophetic ideology has shaped our institutions, that we're standing on rotten foundations that we don't interrogate. We laud the prophets as being justice seekers, but actually when you look underneath the surface, it's very harmful. It's a type of leadership that demands followers. It's hierarchical, misogynistic, and competitive. And we know the harm and the abuse that stems from having those sorts of leadership structures in our institutions. And it particularly affects female leaders who are navigating these patriarchal structures. They're expected to be alone, to be silent, to suffer, to burn out, to fit into a model that doesn't serve us and is harmful. So it's vital that we start through my research and all together to really interrogate what prophecy, what leadership, and what authority is, so that we can reshape it. So my study seeks to bring marginal female characters together who were never seen as prophets because they were either far too threatening to do so, or they were just ignored and silenced and erased, and to bring them together and to call them prophets now, who are acting prophetically. And it's to bring those together to create alternative worlds and sisterhoods, and then to go and study these female characters with women today to seek to hear their experiences of how maybe they've been silenced and erased, and how they're trying to seek justice and truth tell in their communities. It's really going to prioritize the voice of women and their experience of those who have survived harm in toxic places. And hopefully by reading together in a new way, we can chart a new way forward for all of us. Thank you.
Wonderful. I didn't even have to do a 1 minute mark. Amazing. Brilliant. I have so many questions. I'm not allowed to ask them. So I'll turn to our third speaker. Sukhvinder, please take the floor, and I will hold up the cards when I need to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huda. I wanted to begin with a piece of scripture. It is part of the strapline of Sikh Women's Aid. It really guides me in the day-to-day work that I do. Also, it serves as a reminder that God belongs to no gender because he belongs to no gender himself, even though I say himself. See where we are with it all. But the scripture I quote is, "From woman, man is born. Within woman, man is conceived. To woman, he is engaged and married. Woman becomes his friend. Through woman, the future generations come. When his woman dies, he seeks another woman. To woman, he is bound. So why call her bad? From her, kings are born. From woman, woman is born. Without woman, there would be no one at all. O Nanak, only the true Lord is without a woman. That mouth, irrespective of gender, which praises the Lord continually, is blessed and beautiful. O Nanak, those faces shall be radiant in the court of the true Lord." What that is, sorry, it always brings a bit tears to my eyes, because that is a conversation that Nanak had with the God within him, and he is sharing with the world the words that God told him about woman. So my role on this planet, in Sikh Women's Aid, in my family, in life, is secure. That in God's eyes, I belong to him first and him alone. And that is what guides the work of not just me. It is infused into the philosophy at Sikh Women's Aid. Now, I was asked to talk about opportunities and obstacles that I have come across. Now, the Sikh faith, I always call us the baby faith, because when we were being founded, Britain was just beginning to start its colonial quest in India. So that's how new we are as a founding faith. I've always hated the notion that we were a religion, we were a framework of thinking that someone from any belief system could pick up, read, and identify with. So when I think of opportunities, the first opportunities that I see are women and their personal faith. I believe that in the here and now, the curiosity of women and girls and their relationship with God, faith, spirituality, and also faith's commentary on violence against women and girls, we have so much opportunity to educate and inform. In the Sikh community, we have three main sources of information: our scripture, our historical texts, and then we have our Rehat Maryada, which is the code of conduct that was applied to the two strands of Sikhs, which is the Sikh, and then you have the Khalsa, like myself, that are baptized. So for me, there is so much opportunity, because I will share the links in the chat. From the beginning of forming Sikh Women's Aid, faith and spiritual abuse is something we have weaved into our charitable objectives, into our support package, and everything that we do for victims, because we are not shy about talking about perpetrators, because that's what people in faith are, who use faith to perpetrate. So the language that we use is so important. No perpetrator should ever get a green pass on language and somehow have divine language appropriated towards him just because he hides behind the veneer and the cloak of godhood, religion, and sainthood. Access to literature, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities we have today, because access to faith literature bypasses the middleman. And in our situation, these are those patriarchal structures that have stranglehold our gurdwaras, our mosques, and our faith spaces, right through to children's camps, children's language classes, Children are caught from a very, very young age in very distorted interpretations due to these middlemen. Access to literature, the internet, social media. I think there is so much opportunity to erase this middle management in faith to bring the seeker to the thing that he seeks. So I think there's massive opportunity there. This one I put in both camps of opportunities and obstacles, which is the sector recognition and discussion of violence against women and girls in a faith context. Now, I do not think that the sector here in England does this well at all. I think the Faith and VAWG coalition is one of the most exciting opportunities to emerge in recent times, I think, really to grapple with women, our relationship with God and theology, and pushing back against the men, not just the male patriarchy, but also the matriarchal institutions that exist within faith settings as well. So I'm going to come on now, I'm going to move on to my obstacles section here in terms of what terms. Oh, excellent, 5 minutes. I am on time. Thank you, Uda. So when we think of obstacles, one of the biggest things even the previous speakers have discussed is the enmeshment of faith and culture. Now, those of my sisters who are from Pakistan know that Pakistan wasn't even a thing until the British left India. We were one people culturally. And even in our faith narratives and our faith engagements with each other, are we so different? If we are going to London, if you go down the M6 and I go down the M1, as long as we end up in London, are we going to argue that the M6 had a better road journey than the M1? Or are we concerned with arriving to our destination? For millennia, humanity coexisted, irrespective of the ways it found itself back to its creator. And I think the obstacle, the biggest obstacle we have in today is seeing ourselves as different when actually we bleed, we are born, and we die, and we are created by the same source entity. Where are we so different as male privilege has been drilling into us for millennia, that we are different? And yeah, absolutely, we have differences. But at the fundamental level, a soul conscious level, we are but one. We are the creator simply playing within himself. And when he seeks fit, he will close us and emerge us back into ourselves. So when I'm going to come back to obstacles in separating faith and culture, culture can be a very powerful thing. But when you enmesh the two, the Sikh Punjabi community right now, up until 10 years ago, were the biggest perpetrators of female infanticide. So even for Sikh Punjabi women, violence against women and girls would begin within the womb, because of a cultural belief that a daughter was a burden and a man was a privilege, because he would be able to provide for the parents and he would be able to sustain, whereas the daughter was seen as the burden due to outdated notions of culture, that she was a burden that would have to be married, that would have dowries associated to it. Whose cultures were these? Dowry and female inheritance are two very different concepts. Dowry has now overtaken female inheritance, where payments to daughters were given for safeguarding. Now that has become payments for marriage. So some of the biggest obstacles is the women themselves coming into female gatekeepers. Now I have a very derogative term, but I've never held back on my derogatory term against male spiritual perpetrators and abusers of faith. And I call these women the bitches of patriarchy, because and they are those women who unfortunately will espouse what they have learned, they will embrace it, and the patriarchs will put this layer of matriarchs in front of us to stop us from challenging. I do not think there is enough discussion about the role of female matriarchs and how much damage they have done in collusion with the patriarchy. So when we're talking about patriarchy, we cannot avoid the discussion and the obstacles presented by women. The final point I want to come to is the abysmal sector and statutory service response to spiritual abuse in the context of VAWG. I'm thinking legal definitions of spiritual abuse. Sadish and I spent 5 weeks in court watching a man who had spent 3 generations abusing grandmothers, then their daughters, then their granddaughters as well. Here in the United Kingdom for 30 years, a man who has been reported to the police, he has been reported to social services, he has been reported to councils, yet he still is allowed to practice and run a mandir in the middle of Coventry, and thousands of people flock to him. So we do have to look at the work ahead of us in terms of the statutory and the sector response to women who suffer abuse from the hands of spiritual perpetrators. And I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Linda, that was so powerful. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Dr. Ava.
I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Wow, I'm still digesting what I've been listening to. I wanted to begin really by thinking about barriers or obstacles to women. By and large, African and Caribbean heritage or Black church women who I've had occasion to interview on their experiences. And the barriers are both external and internalized. To begin with, let's think about what underscores some of those barriers. Some of those barriers are underscored by exclusionary practices. That there exists such a thing as Black churches is as a result of racist exclusions. So people came over here in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, wanting to worship in churches, and arrived in churches and were politely told that they weren't welcomed or they were unwelcome. So they sought alternative spaces to be. So these spaces that they sought were really beautiful, safe spaces. They were safe spaces from the assaults of racisms. People could settle well, people could learn well how to be good British citizens within the UK. The problem happened really within these spaces is if a woman's in a relationship with a man and the man becomes abusive. What do? There's all of these really difficult dilemmas. So in terms of the external pressures on women, there isn't, in Christianity, marriage is considered to be a wonderful and beautiful thing. So there's a discussion about marriage in lots of churches, and, Christians don't do divorce. But some of the more difficult conversations as to how do we make a distinction between marriage and abuse, some of those discussions don't really happen. A lot of church leaders are not really comfortable having those particular discussions if they aren't already discussing more personal things from within sermons. And also, these very churches in particular, Black churches where the majority of the congregation are, they can be any denomination, but the majority of the congregation are Black, they may seek to conceal the abusers if they're also ministers. Very common practice that happens across all sorts of churches in all different settings in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, etc. So those are the sorts of external pressures. Some of the internalized pressures are the ideas about marriage, the ideas about the interpretation of scriptures, the idea that the perpetrator or the person who's abusing the woman might have used some of those scriptures to keep that woman in an abusive situation. Wives must submit to their husbands, etc. And also the shame and the embarrassment from being in a relationship where there was some kind of dysfunction. That shame is also racialized for Black church women in the sense that Black families are often constructed as dysfunctional, not really the norm. So people are wanting to uphold these sorts of relationships for lots of different reasons. And the idea that the woman can pray and God will work it out. Yes. If she just carries on to pray, God will work it out. And there are different experiences with those. Women do seek help from their pastors. And some of the information I'll share in a minute kind of shows that when women aren't really listened to in particular ways. Some are and some aren't, or some are supported in a very quiet way. So the next person who's having that particular experience might not know exactly where to go or what to do. Yeah, so they're caught in this. This is a safe space. Those people are out there, they're not very safe. Oftentimes, that might well mean that women stay longer in situations where, they're being abused. In some work that I did with the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum, they worked on the Restored Pack, and they came up with this idea, or we came up with this idea that as well as all of the things that women need to have in terms of their spirituality when they're seeking support, to encourage them to leave situations that can be dangerous, they also need a kind of spiritual release, a spiritual guidance. If faith is a really important part of a woman's life, they need to know how to manage without that marriage, without that that idea of themselves that they once had, that they've grown up with. Okay, in terms of barriers researching Black church women, yes, okay. There's always a tension between the research findings, i.e., women find that, lots of women could say, well, as a result of my experiences in church with my partner who was abusive, I've moved away from my faith, and there's a whole variety of experiences. What I found a lot was their faith was the thing that kept them through. Their faith, their belief in God, their spirituality kept them through. When they couldn't reach out to services, they had this guiding light. They had this idea, this sense that God had them, that everything would be okay in the end. Women do eventually seek support, but they describe long periods of being in positions where they felt held and supported. Obviously, in terms of a lot of, at the time, a lot of academic knowledge around that time was that, religious spaces are bad. They're complicit with violence against women and girls, which is not the reading I had interviewing, kind of women and girls who had experienced violence and abuse. They found those church spaces transiently supportive, especially as children, and they would come back in and out of those particular communities, depending on how supportive they were to them. Another of the challenges is just finding funding for research. Pre-COVID, a lot of the reasons were really good research, but it's a religious thing, and we don't really fund religious organizations. Notwithstanding that there are a bunch of women who are not really being supported by the services already existed because they're behind these communities that are considered to be religious. And the priority really should be the women who are caught between these complex intersections. Do we know what they're saying? Do we know whether they're being supported? Do we know what routes they're using to access support? Are they any more endangered than women who are accessing support by going to their local refuge? We don't know. Another of the barriers is that because, rightly so, communities are quite suspicious. Faith communities, church communities are quite suspicious of outside help and want to manage things inside. And as researchers, whether we consider ourselves to be insiders because we're Christians, because we're Caribbean, we are considered to be outsiders because we represent the state, inquiries in ways in which church communities don't feel quite comfortable to engage with at current. So trust is a huge thing in terms of communities. We don't automatically get the trust because we look like the congregants, or we come from similar backgrounds, or even if we are of similar beliefs or faiths. Some of the quotes I want to share from women. This is a woman who took a photograph of her faith, and her faith always gave her, I think it's in Christopher, gave her this sense of joy that she could always hold on to no matter what. And in terms of the churches, in the most recent bit of research I did, they said, these things happen in churches. It's rampant in churches. Women or men coming into churches, coming off the streets because they look at that place and the girls are pure, the girls are holy. And so they target vulnerable ladies in their church or their children. I know women who have gone through physical abuse, sexual abuse in their families, and they don't talk about it. It's not given any life. It's probably, speaking to the church communities, the only place in the UK whereby we are in the majority, where, most places you're not in the majority. And I guess it's just the freedom of being yourself. So the dilemma here is captured by these quotations. Women are experiencing difficulties and violence and abuse, have a difficulty speaking about it. They want to be in those church communities. They could be a little bit dangerous, but outside might be even more dangerous. So these are some of the dilemmas that women face, that Black church women face when they experience violence, violence from their spouses, partners, parents. So what were women's responses? So transient attendance, they'll go, their church going will be frequent, and then they won't go for a while. They might attend online. One of the things we found more recently is that a lot of the women created their own NGOs, their own organizations, offering support, offering training in the absence of any considered support from their faith communities. Many may lose faith, or they shift their understandings of faith and their relationship to their creator or to God. Overwhelmingly, a lot of the people who've responded in terms of research, they want church leaders to do better because they have power. When church leaders advocate an anti-abuse message from the pulpit, more victim survivors come forward, more people want to speak about what's happening, more can be done. We've done in the work in the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum, we've done some training with churches, and it's been amazing, empowering church leaders to engage on a community level with how to better respond to their congregants. This work is ongoing, it's fledgling, but it's happening, but it needs so much more. There are so many tensions around this work, and there is that kind of tension that, in doing this work, in shining a light onto it, it's also a betrayal in a way. It's a betrayal of communities because we're presenting communities not as they could be, but as they are. And at the same time, we're actually speaking to the humanity of the women and men in those very same communities. That's it. That's what I had to say.
Thank you, Eva. That was really, really insightful. Everyone in the panel have just given so much food support that we're really appreciative of your time and the sharing and the generosity of your expertise. We're open now to a discussion, and I know it always takes a bit of a while for people to feel comfortable to ask questions, and I'm sure that everyone's completely taken by your words that you have shared with us. So I think, if I may, I'd like to kind of put the first couple of questions to you. And we have until, I think, 2:25, or is it 1:25? Sorry, I'm in a different time zone. 1:25 to before we kind of ask you for feedback, and we'll post a link for feedback. So I'd like to ask each one of you what single kind of practical issue that you feel in your field needs urgent attention in relation to how, whether it's scripture or institutions, whether religious or so-called state or social justice, need to tackle or understand before they can really claim to be supporting gender equality and ultimately help to end violence against women. And I'll leave it up to any of you to kind of pitch in and start. Maybe Sukhvinder, I know you have very passionate views about that. Maybe you could start us off. But be brief, my dear, because we want everybody.
Yeah, I was just about to put my hand up. It's really simple. The siloed working of agencies when it comes to spiritual abuse, DBS checks not being mandatory. We have a government, previous governments, I would even argue current governments, who are not interested in faith-based or spiritual abuse. We have such a intersecting layer of problems that I think we've got a decade ahead of us to make any real change when your government doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that our faith institutions in this country are not being governed, managed properly. Safeguarding is not on the agenda. We've had the ICSA report come out. It's been 3 years, 21 recommendations. There has been no work done just to get very basic things such as just safeguarding mandated in law with sanctions if you are not safeguarding your congregation. Faith institutions, by their very nature, are meant to be safe spaces. Right now, they are a perpetrator's playground. This is what we see in the Sikh Punjabi community. Perpetrators are purposely going into faith settings for character rehabilitation, personality rehabilitation. Then they are able to tap into a community structure behind them that further isolates victims. And there is nothing being done about this from a policing perspective, locally, government perspective, statutory service, unless you're an agency like ours that openly says we will support victims of spiritual and faith-based abuse. Even services like, generic services, I would say, are turning victims away when they need support and advice on how to get justice because it's too difficult. We don't want to touch this. Let's shut it down before this gets messy and we mess with community tensions. Policing around spiritual abuse is shocking. I mean, I could go on, but I'm going to stop there.
I just wanted to say 2 things. I think, yes, following on from that, we just need this every woman approach. Mullivel and Acte, they had this beautiful research in Bristol about we just don't recognize faith when it's every woman, as opposed to maybe associate faith with culture. So we can't do that because it's to do with women who are not English or women from somewhere else. Lots of women have a faith. And are we saying because you have a faith, you can't have access to services? These things should be pitched in that particular way. And additionally, in terms of faith organizations, is to have those theological conversations, those scriptural conversations when ministers or leaders are engaging with individuals so that they can know, I don't think this is right, I think this is abuse, or they can have it validated by somebody from the pulpit to encourage them to speak more, and also to get access, to be part of that conversation that's going on within communities, within wider communities on violence against women, and not just turn up at the end for the homicide reviews. It's just outrageous.
That is such a good point. Thank you very much. Rabbi, would you like to?
Yeah, I think 2 things, I mean, there's so much, isn't there? But I think 2 things come to mind in this moment. Firstly is research. There isn't a lot of research, especially within Jewish communities, about abuse. Spiritual abuse, the term is relatively new in the work of Professor Lisa Oakley. But research really to be able then to take to communities, to show evidence, to bring stories. So I think for one, there's something about research. There's also something about training to have these conversations. I don't think they're happening a great deal in the public conversations in the Jewish world. They're starting to. Obviously, the Jewish world's diverse and varied, but generally it's not a conversation. And the training is vital and needs a collective response across the world, really, the Jewish world, to realise that it's not just a Jewish thing, but it certainly is a Jewish thing. To understand how abusers are protected within institutions, that a phrase like, well, it's just what they're like, or they've always been like that, how harmful that is, and to really unpack the hierarchies we have in communities. We got told recently, we heard about an abuser within my wider community, that he was just a lone wolf, and the harm that that kind of narrative gives is really awful. So really to be able to do training and research to unpack some of that. I think there's also an issue that we have, and I'd be interested, I'm sure others on the panel have it as well, that but particularly around talking about abuse within Jewish communities, there's a fear that we stoke anti-Semitism. We know anti-Semitism is on the rise, as Islamophobia is, and many hates are at the moment, that by talking about it, we're bringing a bad energy or even more, fuel to the flame, and to really talk about how that's not right. So we have a responsibility to protect those who are vulnerable. And also, just lastly, to keep interrogating leadership. I think religious leadership, I say it as a rabbi, attracts certain personalities. So to really think about how are we training our religious leaders, and what do they understand about what abuse is, all of the nuances of it, not just maybe sexual abuse, but coercive, financial, spiritual. Do they understand what that looks and feels like as well? So yeah, training and research really are the two big things.
Thank you. Professor Asma, I was wondering whether, picking up on Rabbi Robin's point, do you think that there is a potential or hope, or it's feasible that there would be theologically evidenced training or inspired sort of modules in seminaries that would teach the idea of how scripture can be used to hold perpetrators to account, to speak about against violence against women and girls? From your experience, where does religious knowledge play a role in this dynamic?
My experience is pretty limited, Huda, and every time I am in a panel like this, I'm always struck by what a huge gap there is between those of us who've spent our lifetime within the so-called ivory towers, removed from everything, and people on the ground. And one of the things that Zaina Anwar, who used to be in Sisters of Islam, told me when we met in Egypt, is that when I said the same thing to her, she said, but there is a link between us. It's just that you don't know it, because some of the work you do, Amina Wadood does, other scholars have done. She says, we activists on the ground take that work seriously, and then through our, activities, we put it out there. But there are two things I will say, that in Indonesia, when Lili Munir was still alive, they basically revamped the curriculum of the pesantren, which were the schools. So right from get-go, children in Indonesia began to read about Quranic views of equality between women and men. So that was one way in which this was done. And another time I read that in Morocco, that they are training women who will lead women's prayers and, reach out to women to speak about these issues to them. But as an academic, honestly, I haven't had to grapple with that. And I should also say, I do not belong to any community here. I have lived in the US for 40 years, and the closest community is Cornell University. And over there, there are 10 Muslims with 5 different affiliations, and everybody's at everybody's throat. I did not come all the way here to be put upon by people like that. I have chosen a life of complete social isolation to the extent that is possible. So that's selfish, but I need, at this stage of my life, I'm in my mid-70s, to be able to take care of my mental health as well. Because even speaking about this gets me so riled up. It's not like you just talk about it and then go about your day, though. You just get, somebody wrote in chat, I feel gutted. It's like, yeah, welcome. All of us feel gutted.
Absolutely. I think you're so right in mentioning the kind of impact that this kind of work, we're dealing with toxic, harmful material, and we're bound to be impacted by that. And if, women like yourselves who have spent years working on this issue and from a place of sincerity and expertise and empowerment and belief, feel the need to isolate themselves in the only way to protect themselves from further harm, really tells you the scale at which we are battling. So, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants like yourself. So thank you for all the work that you do. I have a question. If anybody doesn't have an, go, Rabbi Robin.
Yeah, just really quickly, I found that very powerful. Thank you, Asma, because I think that's another area that is really needs so much more work. It's about what happens to women when they leave communities. I think I always think of the image of the Emperor's New Clothes. You know, once you start to see this stuff, you can't unsee it. It's baked into like liturgy, into small interactions in the hall, you know, around food. You see it everywhere. For me, I've left community. Well, not all communities, but particular communities. And the pain that causes and the isolation, and then where do the stories go, where do the experiences go? So I think there's a massive piece to do about women and those who have been persecuted leaving communities. Are there rituals for them, and then can new communities be formed? I guess that's the question. So I recognize myself in what you said there.
That's very powerful. So Glinda, you had...
Yeah, just to come in on that, Robin, 100%. And when we launched Sikh Women's Aid, I had death threats. My car was smashed in. My windows were smashed in. I had men turning up in vans outside my children's school because I attended a Sikh faith school with my children. So in order to do the work that I'm doing, I've had to relocate now. And like half of my family, my friends, I've left a huge community. I'm going to come at it from a different perspective. It has been liberating for me because a community that weighs you in its falsehood becomes a weight and a burden that is very difficult to carry. I think there is a massive piece of work, and we're working at that at Sikh Women's Aid, on rebuilding sisterhood, because the community that needs to exist doesn't necessarily have to be a physical one. Faith gives you the power to develop communities based on vibrational frequencies, based on similar experiences. And when we come to the spiritual beings of who we are, building communities is not difficult. It's being brave enough to have that recognition that I need something that is not this. This might be the popular thing, but if 50 people are jumping off a bridge, you're not going to go jumping off the bridge after them because it's what everyone's doing. So, you know, I think there is a shift coming where communities can be formed. And this is where online communities, WhatsApp communities, digital communities have a way of really bringing women together.
Wonderful. I wanted to put a question to Ava. We've had a question from the audience that says, within the third sector in the UK, it feels like there is still very suspicion around faith and religion when it comes to funders, multi-agency working with statutory services. What do you think needs to happen to shift this reluctance to fund and engage with charities that have faith basis, which all of you mentioned, but I remember particularly, Ava, you sort of noted as a challenge.
I do think it's an issue, but I also think that we have the Faith and VAWG Coalition. It's a space to come and have those conversations. I do believe that it's a kind of, I look at it in a very, very colonialist sense, and it's almost like faith has been viewed as this primitive way of being within this very enlightened society. You know, put it away, do politics, leave your faith behind. I think that's what really needs to be challenged, and not to privilege women who don't have a faith, who've left their faith behind, over women for whom faith is still really, really important, and for whom a lot of women, they would say, it's my faith that kept me through, you know, in the absence of any other form of support. So that's a conversation that I think they should have with the Faith and VAWG Coalition, and fund those charities. Go and speak to, go and ask them, why is it you want funding for this particular thing? It's been an incredible frustration, certainly in my journey, to this sort of research, and it needs to stop. It's an inequity, and I think it's dangerous for the women and children who are subjected to it as a result of not gaining access to support because there aren't any services.
Thank you. That's very powerful. I think, all of you have touched on some of the reasons why we have the Faith and VAWG Coalition, because we recognize that being a woman of faith, a believing woman, but a woman who also may describe herself as a feminist or a womanist or somebody who believes in equality is dislocated and is on the margins of various communities, and it can be a very lonely place. And so there is power in community and healing in community, and that's what we would like for all of us, to have a sense of belonging and solidarity and sisterhood. And you're absolutely right about the lack of understanding about faith being a way of identifying. And we can go back to kind of the history of secularism in Europe and white supremacy and how it kind of understood faith and has used it to be a power for harm, but also where has it been a power of liberation, like in South Africa and other places. So I think it is understanding these nuances that we at the Faith and VAWG Coalition are about recognizing and naming and mobilizing to create some momentum around that. And we're so very grateful for your support and input, and we're grateful for you to be part of our family and our sisterhood. I'd just like to remind people that I know Nana has posted on the chat, the CEO Forward. We will be hosting another event in conjunction with Forward in November to bring amazing scholars like the women in front of you today in person. So please look out for that, and we will try and have a follow-up to this conversation. Also, please fill out the evaluation form about today's webinar. I'll ask colleagues to, it's just been posted in the chat, so please do that. It leaves me with 1 minute to say a huge and profound thank you to each and every one of you that attended the webinar. This is our first webinar as an independent charity, and we are very, very excited. But also to the sisters that have spoken today, you have touched on very deep and powerful themes that are very personal, but also political for us. And I really am very grateful to your generosity and spirit for joining us. If anybody wants to have a word of closing, you have 30 seconds. But I appreciate your support and your knowledge and your generosity and sisterhood. Thank you.
It has. It's been, thank you guys. I've learned so much from you guys today, even as a panelist. I'm just like processing so much you shared. Thank you so much, ladies. The work you do is incredible, and I hope our paths cross again in the future.